All right, so are you ready to dive into something a little provocative today?
Always up for a challenge.
Okay, good, because we're taking a deep dive into this book. She Comes First, The Thinking Man's Guide to Pleasuring a Woman.
Ah, yes, by Ian Kerner.
Yeah, PhD, even before opening it up. I mean, come on, that title.
And the papaya on the cover.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It definitely grabs your attention.
It certainly does. It makes you wonder if that's intentional. Like, is he trying to shake things up a bit? Challenge how we usually talk about this stuff.
And the endorsements on the back are pretty wild, too. Like Playgirl magazine calls it, an entire book written strictly for the pleasure of women by a man. Hallelujah.
That's quite an endorsement.
It is. Makes you want to see what all the fuss is about.
Well, I think Kerner's background as a PhD and a clinical sexologist definitely, brings some weight to the topic.
Oh, for sure.
And the dedication to his wife, Lisa, and then the epigraphs from Clark Gable and Albert Camus, it hints at a perspective that's not just purely clinical.
Okay, so let's get into it. Right off the bat, Kerner makes a pretty bold statement. He argues that cunnilingus isn't just foreplay, but it can be the most fulfilling way to a woman's orgasm.
You're right about that being bold. It's interesting, though. Why do you think he puts so much emphasis on that?
Well, he actually shares a personal story about how his own experiences led him to that realization.
Yeah.
He even talks about being stuck in what he calls the missionary rut for years, prioritizing penetration.
Huh. So it seems like he's really going against what society often teaches men about sex.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's suggesting that the emphasis on penetration often overshadows other forms of intimacy that could be way more satisfying for women.
Interesting.
He actually coins this term outer course to highlight how important clitoral stimulation is.
Outer course. I like that. And it's not just his opinion either. He brings in research to back it up, like that Red Book survey he mentioned.
Oh, right, where women ranked cunnilingus as the most satisfying sexual activity.
Exactly. It makes you wonder why this isn't talked about more openly.
It really does. Maybe it's because of all the misconceptions and lack of understanding about female anatomy and pleasure.
Yeah, you might be right. There's that whole myth about the clitoris just being a tiny button.
That he totally debunks, right?
He does. He goes into detail about its surprisingly complex 18-part anatomy.
I know. I had no idea it extended so far internally.
It's a vast network of nerves and erectile tissue.
Wow.
Far more intricate than most people realize. And Kerner, he uses really vivid descriptions and analogies to help illustrate it. Like he compares the clitoris to a wishbone.
A wishbone, really?
Yeah, to really emphasize its structure and the potential for pleasure there.
I mean, that's fascinating. It makes you think about how that lack of understanding might contribute to the focus on penetration over clitoral stimulation.
That's a good point. And he doesn't stop there either. He also tackles those often misunderstood concepts of the G-spot and female ejaculation. What were your thoughts on his perspective on those?
Well, he doesn't completely dismiss the G-spot, but suggests that what people often attribute to it might actually be explained through clitoral stimulation, given how extensive its internal structure is.
So he's kind of reframing the whole concept.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And with female ejaculation, he acknowledges it's a real thing, but he's careful to say that not all women experience it, and it shouldn't be seen as like the ultimate goal.
So again, he's shifting the focus away from a penetration-centric view of sex.
Right. It's more about a holistic approach to female pleasure, recognizing that every woman's experience is unique.
It's refreshing, isn't it? He even introduces this concept of a sexual style that men should develop.
Yeah.
Based on communication anticipation and a deeper understanding of their partner's anatomy and preferences.
It sounds like he's advocating for a much more mindful and individualized approach to intimacy.
I think so. And it's interesting how he even gets into specific techniques like scent touch rhythm.
But even then, it's not just a list of instructions or anything.
No, it's not. It's more like he uses these playful art analogies.
Oh, yeah.
Jackson Pollock licks the lily pad. Like he's encouraging men to think of themselves as artists, creating a sensual experience.
I love that analogy. It makes it feel less clinical and more like an exploration.
Exactly.
But before we get too carried away with the artistic side of things, I do want to mention that the book also addresses safety and responsibility.
Oh, absolutely.
Kerner has a whole chapter on STDs and safe sex practices, especially with cunnilingus.
He does.
He talks about dental dams and other ways to protect yourself because obviously prioritizing pleasure shouldn't mean throwing caution to the wind.
Right. He's promoting a balanced approach where pleasure and safety go hand in hand.
For sure. And ultimately for Kerner, it's not just about technique.
It's not.
He goes beyond just the mechanics of sex and talks about cunnilingus as an act of love, intimacy, and deep connection.
He even makes a connection to that closing scene in the film adaptation of Milan Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being.
Where the protagonist rediscovers that profound connection through physical intimacy.
Yes, exactly.
Hmm.
Kerner sees that same potential in cunnilingus.
It's a powerful statement.
It is.
This is already so thought-provoking. So much to unpack here. What are some of the key takeaways that stand out to you so far?
Well, I think Kerner's challenge to the traditional way we rank sexual acts is pretty significant.
You mean putting cunnilingus front and center instead of relegating it to just foreplay?
Exactly. And this whole idea of reframing the clitoris as this complex, multifaceted source of pleasure, it's not just about finding a button,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
about understanding this intricate interplay of nerves and stimulation.
And this whole concept of developing a sexual style
Yes.
that's individualized and based on communication.
Yeah.
It's like he's rewriting the script for how men approach intimacy.
I think that's a great way to put it.
This is already blowing my mind. There's so much more to dig into, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is like he's encouraging a whole new way of thinking about female pleasure.
Absolutely. And I think it requires men to unlearn a lot of what they've been taught about sex. Kerner argues that men are often conditioned to approach sex from a goal-oriented perspective.
Like, it's all about achieving orgasm as quickly as possible.
Exactly. It's what he calls the premature ejaculator's script, where the focus is on reaching the finish line instead of enjoying the journey. And that mentality can be detrimental to a woman's sexual satisfaction.
Because women's arousal is usually more gradual and multifaceted.
Right. Rushing towards penetration misses the opportunity to create a really satisfying sensual experience for both partners.
So how do we move away from this goal-oriented approach? What does Kerner suggest?
Well, he advocates for what he calls core play instead of foreplay, emphasizing that it's not just about warming up, but setting the stage for a truly fulfilling sexual encounter.
Creating an atmosphere of anticipation and desire.
Precisely. He talks about incorporating things like scent touch and even verbal communication to build tension and make the experience more immersive.
I'm curious, though, how much of this is about technique versus really understanding a woman's individual needs and responses?
He actually addresses that. While he does offer specific techniques like lingering kisses, gentle nibbling, exploring various erogenous zones, he emphasizes that those are just starting points.
So it's more about being present and responsive to your partner.
Exactly, yeah. He talks about finding a rhythm that works for both partners, being attuned to subtle cues, and understanding that each woman's body and responses are unique.
It reminds me of how he used those art analogies earlier.
Hmm.
It's about being more like an artist, crafting a unique experience tailored to the individual.
Exactly. He even uses terms like the Jackson Pollock lick and the lily pad to describe different techniques, encouraging a sense of playfulness and exploration.
It seems like he's really trying to destigmatize the whole conversation around female pleasure and make it more accessible for men.
I agree, and I think it's important to point out that he doesn't shy away from the societal context either.
Right.
He discusses how cultural norms and conditioning have shaped our understanding of female sexuality, often to the detriment of women's pleasure.
He talks about how the clitoris was practically ignored by the medical establishment for centuries.
I know it's pretty shocking when you think about it.
It is.
This historical erasure, he argues, has led to this narrow focus on penetration as the primary goal of sex, neglecting the full spectrum of female sexual experience.
And that limited view leads to a less fulfilling experience for everyone involved. It's not a zero-sum game, right? When a woman feels truly satisfied, it deepens the connection and enhances the experience for both partners.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that female pleasure isn't just a means to an end, but an integral part of a fulfilling sexual experience.
Which brings us back to that core message of the book, she comes first.
It's simple, but powerful, right?
Yeah.
It challenges us to rethink our assumptions and prioritize female pleasure.
This has been an incredibly enlightening deep dive so far. We've explored anatomy, debunked myths, discussed techniques, and even touched on the societal context. What do you think, listener? Are you starting to see how shifting our understanding of female pleasure could transform our relationships and our own experiences of intimacy?
It's a question worth thinking about, and there's still more to uncover.
I feel like we're really starting to unravel some deep-seated ideas about sex and intimacy here.
I think so too. Kerner's perspective makes you question the cultural narratives we've inherited. One thing that really stood out to me was his discussion of how language itself shapes our understanding of sexuality.
Oh, interesting. What do you mean?
Well, he points out that the language we often use to describe sexual acts is very focused on the male experience.
Like how?
Well, think about terms like penetration and climax. They center the male experience.
Yeah, that's true. You don't really hear people talking about the intricacies of female arousal in the same way.
Exactly. And Kerner suggests that this linguistic bias can actually perpetuate this hierarchy where female pleasure is secondary.
So, like, by changing the language we use, we might be able to shift our thinking about sex.
That's the idea. He wants us to be more aware of the words we use and try to find new ways to describe the fullness of female sexual experience.
It's like we need a whole new vocabulary for pleasure,
Yeah.
one that doesn't erase women's experiences.
I love that. And
Right.
it connects to his broader point about communication and intimacy.
Oh, right. He talks about how men need to move beyond just asking, "Did you finish?"
Yeah,
and really engage in a deeper dialogue.
exactly. He encourages men to ask questions like, what felt good? What would you like me to do? It's about understanding that a woman's sexual response is complex and multifaceted, and open communication is key to discovering what truly brings her pleasure.
It's amazing how a book about sex can lead to these broader conversations about language and communication and even power dynamics.
It really is. It shows how deeply intertwined sex is with so many aspects of our lives and relationships. And Kerner doesn't shy away from that. He even talks about the impact of pornography,
Oh, yeah.
suggesting that it can often distort our understanding of sex and create these unrealistic expectations.
Right. He talks about how mainstream porn often portrays women as being constantly receptive and easily orgasmic, which can set men up for disappointment and make it harder for them to connect with their partner's actual experiences.
Yeah, he encourages men to be more critical of the pornography they consume and maybe seek out alternatives that show a more realistic and diverse range of sexual experiences.
He's basically saying there's no right way to experience pleasure.
Exactly. What
Yeah.
matters most is finding what works for you and your partner.
It's like he's giving us permission to throw out the rule book and create our own definitions of intimacy.
I think so. It takes the pressure off trying to conform to some external standard and allows us to explore what truly brings us joy and connection.
This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. It's made me rethink so many assumptions I had about sex and intimacy. What are some of the key takeaways that have resonated with you?
Well, I think Kerner's focus on the complexity of the clitoris and how important it is to understand female anatomy has been huge.
Like he's saying, hey, this isn't a mystery, it's a masterpiece.
Exactly. And his idea that cunnilingus isn't just foreplay, but could be the most fulfilling path to a woman's orgasm, that challenges the traditional hierarchy of sexual acts in a really important way.
And that whole concept of developing a sexual style that's based on communication and attentiveness and a willingness to explore, that feels so much more fulfilling than just going through the motions.
It does. It's about approaching intimacy as a shared journey of discovery, not a performance or a destination to be reached.
It's been great diving into this book with you. What final thought would you like to leave our listener with today?
Well, I think Kerner's work encourages us to consider how our understanding of female pleasure shapes our relationships and our own experiences of intimacy. If we can move beyond those old scripts we've been given and embrace a more women-centered approach, what new possibilities for connection and joy might we discover? It's a question worth exploring both individually and together.
That's a beautiful thought to end on. And of course, this deep dive has only scratched the surface of what She Comes First has to offer. We encourage you to pick up a copy and continue exploring on your own. You never know what insights you might find.